Hello, everyone, and we're going to let the participant list fill up. We had quite a few members sign up for this webinar, so we want to make sure that everyone has the ability to hear everything we say. We absolutely thank you for joining us for this webinar. I see the numbers just jumping, and once I see it slow down, then we will certainly get into the webinar details and program, but it keeps jumping, and it's now slowing just a little bit. So over to you, Estelle.
Yeah, let's get started. Thanks very much, Wes. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Restaurant and Catering Association acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Hi, Wes, and I'd like to say hello to everyone watching and also introduce Hugo, who is a new team member to Restaurant and Catering Association. Hugo has started it with us and is filling the very large shoes of Tom Green, who has moved on to a new and exciting role. Welcome, Hugo, and welcome to your first webinar with Restaurant and Catering Association.
Happy to be here, thank you.
I'm going to hand over to Wes now to get into a few details about what we're going to be chatting about today. So let's get into it, Wes.
Thanks very much, Estelle, and thanks everyone. Certainly we're seeing the numbers continue to climb, so thanks for coming into the webinar. We'd like you to use the Q&A function today if you can. We know that everyone loves to use the chat function, but it then requires us to scroll back through the chat to see your questions. But if you use the Q&A, it's much easier for us to then answer the questions or let you know how we're going to answer it, whether we type it in or whether we push it to be spoken about. So please use the Q&A. There certainly will be lots of questions in terms of the roadmap in Victoria, and lots of questions based upon what you may have seen in New South Wales. But what we will say is we made a submission to the Victorian Government on the 8th of September, so just last week, for what we would like to see in a roadmap for reopening. Now, we were just informed today that the Victorian Government is releasing a roadmap on Sunday, so just a few days from now. So we do still have time to get your ideas and questions to the Victorian Government if they have changed since last week. In addition, this is a prep webinar for a webinar next week where we will be taking some of the questions that you can't answer, that we can't answer, to Minister Pakulia next Monday or Tuesday. The details of that webinar will go out in our EDM tomorrow. And we'll take those questions that we can't answer to the minister. And it's great timing because it will be a day or two after the roadmap is released. So certainly, it is absolutely great timing, and it will be very relevant. But Hugo is going to quickly touch on some of the highlights of the submission that we made based upon your feedback in the previous weeks up to the 8th of September. It's going to touch on a few highlights. And then I'm going to answer a few questions that got emailed in advance of this webinar. A couple of them we have to pose to the minister, but certainly I'll answer a couple of your questions based upon our experience in other states, as well as what we know in Victoria. And then we'll open it up for Q&A, and we will have a recording of the webinar so that we can go back and look at your questions and make a question list for the minister, but certainly we'll try to answer as many of them as we possibly can. Over to you, Hugo.
Thanks, Wes, and thank you, Estelle, and hello to everybody. It's a pleasure meeting you all. I'm sure I will get to know all of you very, very well in the next couple of weeks. So the submission that was sent to the Victorian Government pretty much outlines what we think is the most viable way for restaurants, caterers and cafes to open up at 70% and then 80%. And some of the highlights that we sort of featured on, and as I said, I will stress that, as Victoria approaches its initial 70% target for double vaccinated citizens, we do expect in this roadmap on Sunday to see a easing of restrictions. And hopefully the Victorian Government has listened to what all of you have been asking for and what we have been asked for in this submission. So some of the stuff that we'd like to see in the 70% reopening section is pretty much, one person per 2 square meters outdoor with no patron cap, and one person per 4 square meters indoors with no patron cap. Of course, I think we have to concede that, mandatory mask wearing in place for both customers and staff when not eating and dealing with the public, I think is still something that is very important into reducing the spread, as well as check-ins that are mandatory for both QR check-in and the vaccination status, unless, of course, you're exempt for health reasons. And then possibly exploring technologies such as rapid antigen testing, which is testing that basically can tell you that you're COVID negative or positive in about a 15-minute turnaround, which I think is still one of the many ways that we can pretty much help contain the spread and enable you guys to stay open and keep serving patrons. And then pretty much the same thing for functions and events. But for weddings, pushing for dancing only being allowed for the bridal party or a maximum of 20 people at any given time. And then it sort of moves on to keeping, I think what's really important, especially for all of us opening up, is the maintenance of grant support, especially for small business and larger business, and trying to put that keep that going into 2022 to make sure that as much support is given the amount of hardships and the loss of business that will incur due to caps. And then I think finally the most important part is the what we're looking for at 80% reopening, which is the removal of all density rules and limits, and reopening venues to both vaccinated and non-vaccinated persons at that point. But I think that will have to change depending on what the government's health advice is. But I think one of the most important aspects of what we are really pushing for in this roadmap is getting that viability there. For some functions and events operators, certain amounts of people within their premises is just too small to open up, and it's not financially viable. So really getting the balance correct in terms of what makes it viable for you guys to open your doors, I think is what we should really be pushing for. I think it'll be interesting to see what they come to, but I think it is important to note that the Victorian government at least has a roadmap in the first place.
Great, Hugo. Thanks for that update. And again, just reiterating to everyone that per the federal 4-phase reopening plan, they have indicated that at phase C, which is 80%, that all restrictions will be eased. So we will be putting a lot of pressure on the Victorian government to make that happen and not to renege on any of their promises for freedoms at 80% for the vast amount of the population. And certainly we'll be looking to many of you to help us to get the message out because it has been a long time, and Victoria has had more days in lockdown than any other state in Australia, and certainly Melbourne more than any city. I think second in the world to only Barcelona. And so it is very, very important that your voices are carried to the government, and certainly we listen to all of your feedback. And when Hugo spoke about further grant support, he's speaking about reopening grants for that outdoor dining and to get your business reopened, but also the continued business support grants. We know in New South Wales that the Treasurer here is going to keep JobSaver and business support grants flowing until early 2022, potentially the end of January or beyond. And we're going to be calling for that in Victoria also. We do know and are hearing whispers that the disaster relief grants for people that are choosing to stay at home will go away once your state is out of lockdown. Technically, once 70% hits, you won't be in lockdown. It will just be different rules for different people. So we expect that disaster relief will go away, because the technical definition of disaster relief starts with a lockdown in your state or area. So it is important to convey that to your employees, that disaster relief will not be a fallback for them, that likely they will end up having to go on the dole. So I'm going to check the questions.
There's just one that's come in there, Wes. I can read it out to you if you like.
No, it's fine. I have it open. It's just in case. But if any of you are emailing Estelle or have other questions. So mandatory vaccination, will this be mandated by the government? What about venues that have clients booked and deposits paid and want to cancel? So ultimately, what we expect to happen is that the Victorian government will, by public health order, restrict the movement of people. So, and this is based upon what we've seen so far since the pandemic started. They don't mandate vaccination. They don't make vaccination compulsory. What they are likely to do, and there's currently a public health order in New South Wales that looks like this. So if you live in one of the 12 LGAs in New South Wales that are considered hotspots, as of Monday, so just a few days from now, if you want to leave that LGA to go to work in your essential job, and hospitality is essential, by public health order, you must have an ID and proof of one vaccination. Now that means that if you arrived at work and you didn't have an ID and proof of one vaccination, then you're in breach of the public health order. The individual is in breach of the public health order. So they would not be able to, let's say, turn up for work. They're unavailable to work. Now, that is how we expect that the government will affect the 70% freedoms. We've certainly had the Victorian government tell us that there will only be freedoms for those that are vaccinated at 70%, and then no one has yet told us about 80%. So ultimately, it will be about public health orders coming from the government. It will not be necessarily about the government expecting you as a business to decide to mandate or not. Now, some large employers like Crown, Qantas, SPC, and some large restaurant groups have come out in advance of those public health orders and said, because of their workplace health and safety obligations, and because of the workers' comp rules in New South Wales, that they're going to go ahead and make it compulsory for their staff and mandatory. Certainly, there are businesses that are going to do that. So there is a myth as a question. As an employer, we are unable to disclose or request medical status of our staff. How are we expected to manage vax, no vax? That's actually a myth. If your business is smaller than $3 million in revenue, there is no such thing as the Privacy Act. It does not apply. Now, that is federal law. It is not a myth. It's not just us saying it. In fact, the Fair Work Ombudsman sent me an email explaining that the Privacy Act does not apply to any business with less than $3 million in revenue. So you can ask your employees questions about their vaccination status. In addition, the word discrimination legally in the entire country is excluding someone for a characteristic or trait that they cannot change, such as sex, race, disability. Vaccination status is not considered a discriminatory question. It is an inflammatory word that has been used online. And certainly it is a word that many of you have heard or may hear, but it does not apply. It is an inflammatory word, but it doesn't legally apply. The hospitality industry, much like any other industries, have always had a no shirt, no shoes, no service rights as a private business. But again, we expect that it will be by public health order, meaning that it will not be you as a business that has to decide whether or not you accept individuals to enter, it will be part of the QR code check-in process. So, for example, for those of you who may be jumping up and down now at the moment saying, how could that apply, or how could that, how could we, be forced to do that? I work at Restaurant and Catering. I'm exempt. I am allowed to come into the office. However, under New South Wales Public Health Order, I must be checked in. I'm an employee. I must get a green tick to enter this premise. If I do not have this green tick, I'm not allowed by public health order to enter this premise. Now, that's a choice that I make when I turn up to the entrance to this premise. Now, my employer, Restaurant and Catering, by law, cannot let me enter this premise unless I have a green tick. Now, we expect that come the next round of public health orders from Victoria and New South Wales, that they will add your vaccine status, which Service New South Wales and Services Victoria and Services Australia are working together to add. We don't think that it will turn to a green tick unless a single or double jab status is added. So it's really just crossing over the threshold of your premise. Yes, I'm sure there will be questions around takeaway. In New South Wales, they're telling us that the public health order will apply to anyone who's in your premise more than 15 minutes. So that way, anyone who's coming in and out for takeaway can still scan in, but doesn't have to show double vax, or a supplier who comes in, again, can just come in and out in that 15-minute time frame. It is not ideal. We do not like that businesses are going to have to check the ticks of anyone. We think it is, certainly a COVID era requirement that has to go as quickly as possible. We're going to be calling for it to be abandoned as soon as the state reaches 80%. And if the government wants to extend it, we're going to demand a time frame for how long it lasts, because certainly once we're learning to live with COVID, and once the borders are reopened, and once we're getting back to a normal life, we think that all COVID public health orders should expire, and let us get back to a normal existence. So that spurred a couple of questions. Yes, it is absolutely a position of Restaurant and Catering that once we get to 80%, that all hospitality restrictions would be lifted, because that is what the 4-phase national plan says. And all of the premiers have signed up to this plan, especially those on the East Coast. And in the consolidation phase, it says no lockdowns. It says abolish caps. It says lift all restrictions. So we expect the governments to abide by those. And certainly we will come down like a ton of bricks if they try to change the rules of the game in the middle of the game. So thank you for that question. Absolutely. So a question on, it would be really helpful to have a how the public health orders apply video so we can share with our customers and team, whether it's state, government, or alternative industry body. Look, we do expect that once the Victorian government does decide what it's going to do, certainly has not come out as hard in the media as New South Wales had. The Andrews government has said that he expects freedoms for the vaccinated at 70%. And certainly we do expect that it will be different than New South Wales. But at the moment, our expectation and what we're trying to prepare you for as members is that it is likely going to be a public health order on the movement of people. Many of you now are checking in the QR codes of your customers when they come in for takeaway and delivery. And certainly everyone's following mask mandates. And in Victoria especially, there have been public health orders on the movement of Melburnians to the regions and the movement of people in the regions to Melbourne. And so much of that precedent has already been set, and many people are used to those things. So that is what we expect the mechanism to be. It may not be that. The Victorian government may react differently to the New South Wales government, or it may do something different. And certainly we will keep you abreast of exactly what happens when it happens. Once that public health order is made available, hopefully we will get it on Sunday, and we can provide our advice based upon that. However, for any of you who have questions about the Fair Work Commission, I will be sending an email to Estelle and Hugo, which they will happily forward on to you. The Fair Work Commission has said that public health orders is a defense in the Fair Work Commission, because there's lots of precedent about public health orders in Fair Work. For example, I'm an employee in a childcare facility. I refuse to get a flu vaccination. I'm terminated. I don't have a case at Fair Work because it is well established that to work in a childcare facility, you have to get a flu vaccination. There's no argument. I'm a construction worker. I turn up to a construction site in t-shirt, shorts, and thongs. They won't let me come onto the site. I do that 3 days in a row. I get terminated. Well, it's well established that to enter a construction site, you have to have a helmet, a vest, and boots for workplace health and safety. So the mechanisms are there, and we don't want any of you to have any action on any employee. That is the worst case scenario, which is why right now, every hospitality business that wants to reopen at 70% should absolutely be speaking to, surveying, consulting with, working with their employees to understand, so that you can have as high a vaccination rate as possible. Because for many of you, you're also looking at your workplace health and safety. You're looking at, well, am I responsible if my business does have an outbreak and something happens to an employee and they get sick? Or what happens if my business becomes a hotspot? Do I have to close down? Will all of my staff have to isolate? We're fairly sure that many of those isolation rules will likely apply to unvaccinated staff. And certainly businesses that are found to be in breach of the public health orders, even if you disagree with it, will be treated as, as any business that's breaching a Victorian rule. Look, it is not the best scenario. We hate that, any of your customers or staff have to potentially check in at the door. It is a terrible outcome, but we also understand that you as hospitality businesses need to get reopened as soon as possible. And there are very few arguments that Victorian Health have listened to in terms of masks, QR codes, and the movement of people. They've been quite firm on those convictions. So a couple more questions. Will there still be a requirement for tier 1 sites to be closed and cleaned and staff are isolated for 14 days if a confirmed case? So ultimately, we don't know yet. The public health orders have not been issued. And certainly during a transition period, after you get to 80% and you're allowing everyone to come into hospitality, why would you track and trace? We don't track and trace for the flu now. We don't track and trace for colds. So there will come a point in time, but we do think that in that 70 to 80%, it'll be a transition period. So there could potentially be a requirement. Now, those will come out in the public health order on Sunday, and certainly that will frame up how some of those questions will be asked of the minister. So I'm just going to check the chat here. And so someone has said we're higher than $3 million in revenue across the company. I think it's per location. It's different. The discrimination law applies differently than payroll tax and grouping for tax purposes. So certainly Brendan, that's BRENDON at rca.asn.au, and Estelle is going to type that into the chat so that you can ask those legal questions. Brendan is the head of restaurant and catering legal and workplace relations, can absolutely research that for you to whether it applies to the individual ABN or it applies to your company as a grouping, where then you'd have to then rely on specifically on the public health order as whether or not your employees could actually enter the premise. So, that if a public health order says that someone has to turn around their green tick to show you, it's by public health order. And certainly then would allow you by public health order to have a look at that green tick, both staff and patrons. So headed back to the Q&A. Do you have any current dates and timeframes for when the 70s and 80s will be achieved? Got a bit of bad news on that, is that Victoria, for a myriad of reasons, is actually slowing down on the vaccine rollout. And at present, 70% is pegged for mid-November, so well after the Melbourne Cup, and 80% is now pegged for early December, which is why it is so important for you to be speaking to your staff, and certainly, as many high-profile hospitality owners and chefs have gone out into the media and certainly said, it's very important to be vaccinated. It is important that Victoria is vaccinated because there's no other pathway forward in terms of what the government's going to do. They're not just going to magically decide tomorrow, oh, the racing industry is a big lobby, we're going to have Melbourne Cup. Probably not. We don't expect that Melbourne Cup's going to happen with heaps and heaps of people while the rest of the state remains locked down. And certainly you've experienced that. The AFL Grand Final is not there. F1 is not there. The tennis, the state government is prepared to defer and cancel things based upon COVID outbreaks. So please, we are imploring upon you, to your sphere of influence, to get as much information as you can about being vaccinated and passing that information on when you feel comfortable. So are there discussions around a negative test being accepted in the future in place of vaccination for customers and employees? We're making that statement, and that is a great question that we are going to ask the minister next week. Is the Victorian government thinking about rapid antigen testing and thinking about tests as being accepted to come to work or to do things? Certainly in America, for example, Joe Biden has just made it compulsory, so not just mandatory, compulsory for companies that employ more than 100 people to have everyone vaccinated or tested weekly. And so there is that or. Now in New South Wales, there's no testing, rapid antigen testing allowed in the reopening at 70, but absolutely we're going to be pushing for the allowance of rapid antigen testing, especially for function and events, because we do know that once weddings and large private events and corporate events are allowed, that there has to be another solution than keeping people out from the front door when so many people are coming together and there's a list of attendees, and certainly for many reasons that they may not be able to come in. I know a few of you have had questions around medical exemptions. In Australia, when it comes to a GP signing off on a medical exemption for vaccination, there's actually a government mandated form, and the reasons why you cannot take a vaccination are very narrow, and they all require you to have never been able to take vaccinations. So if you've taken the flu shot every year for 20 years, if you've had all of your yearly or periodic vaccinations as a young person, or you've had whooping cough 6 months ago, you will not get a medical exemption for COVID from your GP, because they'll be breaking Australian law to do that. So we only expect that you'll see 1% medical exemptions, and we do expect that Services Victoria will be able to integrate that into the QR code. In New South Wales, they're certainly talking about being able to integrate that in so that those individuals will get a green tick. So going to the chat, I've seen a question pop up there. Do you have a reference? The Guardian Australia has a running date based upon vaccination rates to get to 70%. In addition, there you can go to Hugo will post it into the chat. Hugo, if you could just quickly hop onto the internet. I think it is Services Australia or COVID. I'm trying to remember the secondary source that's made by the government, but Guardian Australia is doing a great job in measuring the timing based upon the state's vaccination rates, and I'm happy to email that out to anyone that would like to see it. But it's speeding up in ACT and New South Wales, and it's slowing down in Victoria, and we understand why. There is a tremendous amount of vaccine hesitancy in Victoria. It is certainly a state that has many people that are very democratic and very much protections of their liberty. But certainly that leads to a slower vaccination rate, and it makes it very difficult for the Premier and the government who have agreed to abide by the national plan in terms of having COVID in the community, but reopening businesses. So for many people, it is, I'm sure in Victoria, you have not forgotten 2020, but in 2020, if we had 450 cases in a day in Victoria, you would be in a hard lockdown with a ring of steel, with very, very many restrictions in place. However, because of vaccination, the government is willing to give it a red hot go and allow the hospitality industry to reopen. And so at the moment, they're telling us that the fastest way to get open faster is that double vaccination rate. So we have a couple more questions. If a company encourages an employee to take a vaccination, the employee suffers an adverse event as the result. What are the implications for this? If any of you bank with NAB, they've changed their logo to JAB. I think it is pretty much well established that providing information about vaccination to your employees and saying get advice from a GP is being said by everyone everywhere. And again, if you're not forcing them to do it, you're just providing them with all of the information available. Again, once the public health order is written, you as a business, all of you would not serve a 12-year-old alcohol if they walked in your business. Therefore, you're enforcing the law of Victoria. Why? Because it's a law in Victoria. You might want to serve a 12-year-old, but you're following the law and you're enforcing the law. You enforce many laws within your business: food handler, food safety, many of the things in your kitchen. You enforce the law when you follow the Fair Work Act and you pay your employees the right amount. Many private businesses enforce the laws of the government every day. COVID is very fast and very new, and there's a lot of opinion both ways, which all opinions are valid. We're not saying that opinions aren't valid. We can only base the advice that we give to you on previous scenarios, and those are typically related to other types of vaccinations or other types of employment scenarios requiring you as a business to follow public health orders, or you as a business to follow the Victorian laws relation to your license or in relation to your premise. So again, providing information does not make you liable for your employees' behavior. So at 70% functions and weddings. So at 70%, what is the submission around numbers for function and weddings, and what restrictions might apply to groups and restaurants mid-November, December, beyond 80? So function events, based upon our feedback from members, we said 1 per 2 outdoors with no caps, and 1 per 4 indoors with no caps. And that's hopefully for a very short period of time. So into early December. And then we are going to continue to press the government from that 80% mark that they promised us no restrictions, and that's what we want. So we don't think that there should be any restrictions past that 80% mark, and we're going to continue to push for that.
If I can just add something to that, what Wes mentioned there, we have also suggested that in the updated table of restrictions that they release in line with that 70%, that we separate events from the food and hospitality banner, I guess. So it would be food and hospitality, food and beverage, it would be food courts, and then also events and caterers, because we understand just how confusing that table of restrictions is for catering and events in particular, where they might fall into a couple of different sections in the table, and just really clarifying that and making it as clear and simple as possible for everyone.
Absolutely. Now, again, as we've said prior, the roadmap that comes out on Sunday, it may only have comments in relation to densities and caps and social distancing and masks. It may say that everything is open to everyone at 70%. Victoria is running its own race, as is ACT, as is New South Wales, and the premiers and chief health officers all have different ideas about what they want to do. All we can do is provide advice based upon what the Premier and Chief Health Officer have said so far in Victoria. And they've said that freedoms will only be available to the vaccinated, but they certainly have changed their mind at the 11th hour many times. So I would reserve all of your concerns until we see that roadmap on Sunday, because that may change many of the questions we asked the minister, and it may answer many of your questions depending upon what it says or doesn't say. We do expect that there will be something related to the public health order, but again, Victoria will likely do it in a way that suits Victoria and the constraints of the Victorian hospital system and the constraints of the Victoria QR codes and check-in out. So,
what I might just put my email address and Hugo's email address in the chat box now as well. Over the next few days, if you think of any questions that you would like us to put forward to Martin Pakula, or even if we might be able to answer them personally, please email them through to us. And then come Sunday, there's probably going to be a lot more questions that might come to mind. So please also reach out to us then. And similarly, we'll probably have answers to a good proportion of them, but those that we don't, we'll be able to put them forward in the webinar with Mr. Pakula.
So someone has asked business grants, licensed hospitality fund, will these continue after we're at full capacity? So in New South Wales, the Treasurer has promised to keep the Job Saver and the business support grants going and the landlord code of practice going until early January. He is requiring that businesses reconfirm every 2 weeks that their revenue remains down at least 30%. Again, we don't know how that mechanism will apply in Victoria, but we will continue to push the Victorian government to keep all business support in place throughout the summer, because we know that it's going to be much different than it was last year, because, the states may stay close to each other well into 2022. Will the 1.5% spacing between tables still play density? Will there be group packs? So look, 1.5%, 1.5 meters was always just a suggestion. Safe Work Australia always said where practical or where practicable. I know many of your local councils or the police in your area may have been very strict in the enforcement, but we had many a cafe and restaurant have us on the phone at 9 o'clock at night, speaking directly to the council officials and speaking directly to the police, saying, Safe Work Australia, this website, this link says where practical or where practicable. So we don't expect that that 1.5 meters is going to continue to be in the public health order. We haven't seen that necessarily in the New South Wales public health orders. And certainly if it is only for vaccinated people and it is 1 per 4 square meters, we just don't expect there to be spacing, and certainly we'll push back on that. Victoria might have group caps. It depends on how many people they're comfortable with at one particular table. And certainly we will want that to be no caps as we go into the Christmas season. That will be a question that we pass on to the minister based upon what the public health order says or what the roadmap says on Sunday. So great question. Please keep the questions coming. We certainly have a bit more time in the webinar and would definitely love to answer. Estelle, you had a few questions come in over email earlier today. If you could just read off a few of those, if we haven't already answered them.
Yeah, great. Let me just bring them up. Should it be considered that the VCGLR issue COVID marshals to regulate COVID compliance matters at venues? So this is really a question about businesses enforcing COVID rules and how that can be unburdened, I suppose, as small businesses and put onto somebody else.
So ultimately, we think that all of the mechanisms that were in place during previous reopening will likely remain in place. It's easy for the government to fall back on what they know rather than coming up with new mechanisms. So imagine it is, the last week in November, you're allowed to reopen to vaccinated patrons who check in a QR code at the door, and it's 1 per 4 or 1 per 2 inside. Let's hope for 1 per 2, but let's say it's 1 per 4 inside and 1 per 2 outside. Ultimately, if everyone's checked in and if they're standing there wearing a mask, that is, we expect that the same type of council and police monitoring will continue to occur. And it depends on the public health order, whether or not they require you to designate a COVID safe marshal. And one thing that I forgot to reiterate earlier is Restaurant and Catering, AHA, and Clubs Victoria are all doing everything we possibly can to get you reopened as soon as possible. And we are all saying the same things, and we all have the same message. We absolutely want to get as many venues open as we can with the least no caps and the best density restrictions that we can have with the least rules possible. So the question is, will double vax be seated service only? That depends. In New South Wales, you can stand up outside in our roadmap. And so it really will depend upon what the roadmap says on Sunday in Victoria. There will be lots of time between when the roadmap is announced on Sunday and when it comes into force. Now, there is a slight chance that in Victoria, they may allow some businesses to reopen at 1 jab. That is possible. Seeing that 2 jabs is so much further away than other states, look, they may, as a government, decide, look, we want to allow some easing at 1 jab, and still require you to cite someone's vaccination certificate. So look, it's a bit of Wild West when it comes to the states right now and their reopening roadmaps. States that are already open aren't even thinking about roadmaps because they're open. But it is to their own peril because they're going to be remained closed to the states that are living with COVID, ACT, New South Wales, and Victoria, where we don't expect it ever to be 0 cases again. Just like it was never 0 cases of the flu, it was never 0 cases of the cold or stomach bug or anything prior to COVID. So, it will be a huge wake-up call for the other states. But as far as Victoria is concerned, once that roadmap is out, we are going to fight tooth and nail to ensure that that roadmap is only in place until 80%.
Thanks, Wes. I did have another question as well, and it was around the mental well-being of hospitality employers and employees, for the near future and the foreseeable future. And we have been in discussions with the Victorian Government about an ongoing kind of 12-month hotline, if you like, for someone dedicated to hospitality workers in particular. And the government is, liaising with a few different associations on setting that up as well. So there is some really good conversation going on about mental health support as well. And we've got some great courses available through our training department as well for those that are interested. I'll put a link in the chat box for that as well.
So I'm just scrolling back on my phone because Minister Victor Dominello in New South Wales sent out a picture of what the app will look like in New South Wales. So for any of you who are saying the government will never do it, it's not going to happen, this is what a check-in with your vaccine status looks like. state and federal government are absolutely working on a QR code check-in that includes your vaccination status. It is not, it's not a myth. It's not, the media, trying to explode a story. The state and federal government are absolutely looking at a QR code option. And that's also predicated by the fact that we expect that the airlines will not allow you to get on a plane without proving your status. And even the airports are considering not allowing you to come in the airport without proving your status. And so, those are regulated by federal and international law. And certainly there is not a country in the world that is not checking your vaccine status on arrival. There are 0 countries in the world that are not checking your vaccine status on arrival. So certainly very, very important that, when you do get pushback from staff or from customers, it is going to basically become a way of life globally, and certainly respect people's hesitancy and wanting to get more information and find out more. However, the walls will be closing in on things like flying and cruising and many other activities where it'll be out of the hands of small business and more in the hands of international and federal laws. So going to, what about elderly people who have older phones or without the necessary technology? Absolutely. There is a vaccine certificate that you get at your GP when you get the vaccination, and this is what it looks like. So that is what a vaccine certificate looks like, and you just print it out, you keep it with you. Yeah, yes, there'll be fraud. Yes, people will carry other people's vaccine certificate. That's unfortunate, but there's fake IDs, and people take other people's IDs to drink. And you as a business, if somebody has a fake, vaccine certificate, that's not on you. Unfortunately, people will do that, but there will be ways for you as a business to affect the public health orders. So it's not you as a business making a decision in most cases. We want businesses to be able to choose to do what they want. However, we don't want the onus, we don't want the pressure to be on businesses to have to choose. If it's going to be a requirement, it has to be by public health order, and the enforcement cannot be on businesses. The onus needs to be on the consumer to be able to check in or not check in, or the staff member to be able to check in or not check in. So headed back to the chat. Nope, that's Estelle's amazing breathe in and breathe out courses. So Estelle, any more questions from email?
No, you've done a really good job, Wes, of going over all of the points that we'd raised earlier, and you need to take a big breath. You've been talking nonstop. Good work. No, you've covered off everything. So if anyone else has any questions to pop in the chat, please go for it now. But otherwise, we've covered off all of the pre-arranged questions that had come through to me.
So please email any questions that you have over the weekend to Estelle or to Hugo. And certainly, I got a question from a member. Thanks, Katerina. I got a question from a member in New South Wales, which was a 3-page email. And I spent about an hour researching all of the sources to every single question that was asked. We go above and beyond for you. There is not a question that we will not suss out the answer unless there just isn't an answer yet. So certainly pass your questions on so that we can get an amazing question list together for the minister, and certainly hold them to task to that roadmap, which is coming out on Sunday. So I'm just going to check the Q&A in the chat one more time, just to be sure that we've answered everyone's questions. Happy days. It seems that we've answered everyone's questions. So just want to thank the team at Restaurant and Catering. Want to thank KK, Kieran, who's our comms guy, who puts these together for us, certainly does an amazing job. Belinda, who keeps us prepped for these meetings and keeps us on track. And certainly Estelle for being an amazing head of membership in Victoria. And Hugo, our brand spanking new, but very well seasoned and very well qualified manager of policy. So happy for either of you to give any closings you'd like.
Oh, no, thank you, Wes. I think it's really powerful, the conversations that we have in these webinars, and I really appreciate the time that you put in. I think the announcement about a roadmap on Sunday is very, very good news. And I think, 18 months into this in Victoria and to finally get a plan, it seems ridiculous that it's taken this long, but it's really, really exciting. And I think waiting for that roadmap on Sunday it's gonna be amazing to have that in writing. So that's really exciting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Hugo, man, a few words, but certainly lots of actions. Thanks, everyone. And Estelle will be reaching out to many of you to be able to ask your questions directly to the minister next week. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.